Hi, and welcome to our reading and study of Chapter 8. I'm on page 52 in my book. I've got my highlighters, I've got my colored pens. And before we get started, just a couple things to keep in mind. Now that we've introduced everyone from Pip's family and his home life on the marshes, in Chapter 8, we're going to get to know a few more characters, and our book is about to take a turn into the world of conflict. A few things to keep in mind. Before you started reading, you were supposed to watch those two YouTube videos about Dickens' influences and Dickens' past and how they showed up in his writing. And one thing those videos said is that Dickens was very aware of the lasting and very real nature of childhood pain. Today we call that childhood trauma, and we know the long-lasting effects of it. But back then it was not something that psychologists studied. But Dickens was writing about it in his book. Over and over again, he has these child characters, these protagonists who had some horrible hardship, some trauma dealt to them as children that they could never get over, and remained a centerpiece of their internal conflict as they progressed through life. Another thing to keep in mind is that you are supposed to have some questions that haven't been answered. This is a mystery. Year after year, I see students get to the end of a chapter and get frustrated or feel like they're simply not getting it if there's questions that they don't know how to answer yet. Some questions have been answered for you. But we are about to introduce and have more of these mysteries unfold in the coming chapters. So don't get frustrated if you get to the end of the chapter and you say, but why is that person the way they are? Or who was that? It's not that you missed something. It's that your author hasn't told you yet. So be patient with yourself and with the book. Another thing to keep in mind is that Pip seems so familiar. Remember, this is a study in archetypes, plot archetypes, character archetypes, object and setting archetypes. Pip is familiar because he is an archetype. Pip's an orphan hero archetype. And to know Dickens is to enrich your reading of so many other books that you're already familiar with. From Harry Potter, James and the Giant Peach from Roald Dahl is one of my favorites. And you have these authors from the last 30 and 50 years that maybe you're more familiar with before you've read this one. Where you have these young protagonists, young male protagonists who grow up as orphans and live with these toady, horrible relatives who are so mean to them, and the pain that these kids feel as they move away from those families and try to search for something better in their life. So Roald Dahl and J.K. Rowling are very much products of the Dickens tradition. All right, let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 8. At the end of the video, we'll do some character analysis. We'll do some comprehension, some frequently asked questions, things like that. So read along with me now. Mr. Pumblechook's premises in the high street of the market town were a peppercorny and farinaceous character, as the premises of a corn chandler and seedsman should be. It appeared to me that he must be a very happy man indeed to have so many little drawers in his shop. And I wondered when I peeped into one or two of the lower tiers and saw the tied-up brown paper packets inside, whether the flower seeds and bulbs ever wanted of a fine day to break out of those jails and bloom. I'm going to highlight that last sentence because, okay, so it's late at night, it's that winter night, and Uncle Pumblechook has dragged Pip along with him to town to see Miss Havisham this very next day. And this last sentence in here, the way it ends, is really metaphorical for Pip and his situation. He's in this trap and he has this desire that he doesn't even really realize yet that he does want to bloom in some other way. It was in the early morning after my arrival that I entertained this speculation. On the previous night, I'd been sent straight to bed in an attic with a sloping roof, which was so low in the corner where the bedstead was that I calculated the tiles as being within a foot of my eyebrows. In the same early morning, I discovered a singular affinity between seeds and corduroys. Mr. Pumblechook wore corduroys, and so did his shopman, and somehow there was a general air and flavor about the corduroys so much in the nature of seeds, and a general air and flavor about the seeds so much in the nature of corduroys that I hardly knew which was which. The same opportunity served me for noticing that Mr. Pumblechook appeared to conduct his business by looking across the street at the saddler, who appeared to transact his business by keeping an eye on the coachmaker, who appeared to get on in life by putting his hands in the pockets and contemplating the baker, who in his turn folded his arms and stared at the grocer, who stood at his door and yawned at the chemist. The watchmaker, always poring over a little desk with a magnifying glass at his eye, and always inspected by a group in smock frocks poring over him through the glass of his shop window, seemed to be about the only person in High Street whose trade engaged his attention. So that sentence right there seems really long and kind of purposeless, but we're about to engage in a novel where all eyes will be on our protagonist. So this idea of everybody's watching someone else and not really paying attention enough to their own business. So whenever you have these details that seem extraneous, ask that question, could this be somehow thematically relevant? Mr. Pumblechook and I breakfasted at 8 o'clock in the parlor behind the shop, while the shopman took his mug of tea and hunch of bread and butter on the sack of peas in the front of premises. I considered Mr. Pumblechook wretched company. Besides being possessed by my sister's idea that a mortifying and penitential character ought to be imparted to my diet, besides giving me as much crumb as possible in combination with as little butter, and putting such a quantity of warm water into my milk that it would have been more candid to have left the milk out altogether, his conversation consisted of nothing but arithmetic. On my politely bidding him good morning, he said pompously, 7 times 9, boy. And how should I be able to answer, dodged in that way in a strange place on an empty stomach? I was hungry, but before I had swallowed a morsel, he began a running sum that lasted all through breakfast. 7 and 4 and 8 and 6 and 2 and 10 and so on. And after each figure was disposed of, it was as much as I could do to get a bite or a sup before the next came, while he at his ease, guessing nothing, and eating bacon in a hot roll, in, if I may be allowed the expression, a gorging and gormandizing manner. For such reasons, I was very glad when 10 o'clock came, and we started for Miss Havisham's, though I was not at all at my ease regarding the manner in which I should acquit myself under the lady's roof. Within a quarter of an hour we came to Miss Havisham's house, which was of old brick and dismal and had a great many iron bars to it. Some of the windows had been walled up. Of those that remained, all the lower were rustily barred. There was a courtyard in front, and that was barred, so we had to wait after ringing the bell until someone should come to open it. While we waited at the gate, I peeped in, even though Mr. Pumblechook said, "And 14," but I pretended not to hear him, and saw that at the side of the house there was a large brewery. No brewing was going on in it, and none seemed to have gone on for a long time. A window was raised, and a clear voice demanded, "What name?" To which my conductor replied, "Pumblechook." And the voice returned, "Quite right." And the window was shut again, and a young lady came across the courtyard with keys in her hand. The paragraph before, with the description of the house, I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to write, we're getting a Gothic mansion description here. So another one of our archetypes, this creepy mansion that's been barred and off limits. And who lives in Gothic mansions? Witches. So here we go. This young lady who comes to the door, though, she's always holding the keys to this rusted barred mansion. That's one of your things, your motifs to look out for. Who has the keys, has the power, who has access, who has what's off limits to who, and who's controlling Pip. "This," said Mr. Pumblechook, "is Pip." "This is Pip, is it?" returned the young lady, who was very pretty and seemed very proud. "Come in, Pip." Mr. Pumblechook was coming in also when she stopped him with the gate. "Oh," she said, "did you wish to see Miss Havisham?" "If Miss Havisham wishes to see me," returned Mr. Pumblechook, discomfited. "Ah," said the girl, "but you see she don't." And she said it so finally, and in such an undiscussable way, that Mr. Pumblechook, though in a condition of ruffled dignity, could not protest. But he eyed me severely, as if I had done anything to him, and departed with the words reproachfully delivered, "Boy, let your behavior here be a credit unto them which brought you up by hand." I was not free from apprehension that he would not come back to propound through the gate, "And 16?" But he didn't. My young conductress locked the gate, and we went across the courtyard. It was paved and clean, but grass was growing in every crevice. The brewery buildings had a little lane of communication with it, and the wooden gates of that lane stood open, and all the brewery beyond stood open away to the high enclosing wall, and all was empty and disused. The cold wind seemed to blow colder there than outside the gate, and it made a shrill noise in howling in and out of the open sides of the brewery, like the noise of a wind in the rigging of a ship at sea. She saw me looking at it, and she said, "You could drink without hurt all the strong beer that's brewed there now, boy." "I should think I could, miss," said I, in a shy way. "Better not to try to brew beer there now, or it would turn out sour, boy. Don't you think so?" "Oh, it looks like it, miss." "Not that anybody means to try," she added, "for that's all been done with, and the place will stand idle as it is till it falls. And as to strong beer, there's enough of it in the cellars already to drown the manor house." "Is that the name of this house, miss?" "One of its names, boy." "It has more than one, then, miss?" "One more. Its other name was Sadis, which is Greek for Latin, or Hebrew, or all three, or all one to me, for enough. I'm going to highlight that phrase in my book. This big mansion is called the Sadis House, and Sadis being Latin for enough. "Enough House," said I. "That's a curious name, miss." "Yes," she replied. "But it meant more than it said. It meant, when it was given, that whoever had this house could want nothing else. They must have been easily satisfied in those days, I should think. But don't loiter, boy." Though she called me boy so often, and with a carelessness that was far from complimentary, she was about my own age. She seemed much older than I, of course, being a girl and beautiful and self-possessed, and she was as scornful of me as if she had been 21 and a queen. We went into the house by a side door. The great front entrance had two chains across it outside, and the first thing I noticed was that the passages were all dark, and that she had left a candle burning there. She took it up, and we went through the dark passages and up a staircase, and still it was all dark, and only the candle lighted us. At last we came to the door of a room, and she said, "Go in." I answered more in shyness than politeness, "After you, miss." To this she returned, "Don't be ridiculous, boy. I am not going in," and scornfully walked away, and, what was worse, took the candle with her. This was very uncomfortable, and I was half afraid. However, the only thing to be done being to knock at the door, I knocked and was told from within to enter. I entered, therefore, and found myself in a pretty large room, well lighted with wax candles. No glimpse of daylight was to be seen in it. It was a dressing room, as I supposed from the furniture, though much of it was of forms and uses then quite unknown to me. But prominent in it was a draped table with a gilded looking glass, and that I made out at first sight to be a fine lady's dressing table. Whether I should have made it out this object so soon, if there had been no fine lady sitting at it, I cannot say. In an armchair, with an elbow resting on the table and her head leaning on that hand, sat the strangest lady I have ever seen or shall ever see. She was dressed in rich materials, satins and lace and silks, all white. Her shoes were white, and she had a long white veil dependent from her hair, and she had bridal flowers in her hair, but her hair was white. Some bright jewels sparkled on her neck and on her hands, and some other jewels lay sparkling on the table. Dresses, less splendid than the dress she wore and half packed in trunks, were scattered about. She had not quite finished dressing, for she had but one shoe on. The other was on the table near her hand. Her veil was but half arranged. Her watch and chain were not put on, and some lace for her bosom lay with those trinkets, and with her handkerchief and gloves and some flowers and a prayer book, all confusedly heaped about the looking-glass. It was not in the first few moments that I saw all these things, though. I saw more of them in the first few moments that might be supposed, but I saw that everything within my view which ought to be white had been white long ago, had lost its luster, and was faded and yellow. I saw that the bride within the bridal dress had withered like the dress, and like the flowers, and had no brightness left but the brightness of her sunken eyes. I saw that the dress had been put upon the rounded figure of a young woman, and that the figure upon which it now hung loose had shrunk to skin and bone. Once I had taken to see some ghastly waxwork at the fair, representing I know not what impossible personage lying in state. Once I'd been taken to one of our old marsh churches to see a skeleton in the ashes of a rich dress that had been dug out of vault under the church pavement. Now waxwork and skeleton seemed to have dark eyes that moved and looked at me. I should have cried out if I could. "Who is it?" said the lady at the table. "Pip, ma'am." "Pip? Mr. Pumblechook's boy, ma'am? Come to play? Come nearer. Let me look at you. Come close." It was when I stood before her, avoiding her eyes, that I took none of the note of the surrounding objects in detail, and saw that her watch had stopped at 20 minutes to 9, and that a clock in the room had stopped at 20 minutes to 9. "Look at me," said Miss Havisham. "You are not afraid of a woman who has never seen the sun since you were born." I regret to state that I was not afraid of telling the enormous lie comprehended in the answer, "No." "Do you know what I touch here?" she said, laying her hands one upon the other on her left side. "Yes, ma'am." It made me think of the young man. "What do I touch?" "Your heart." "Broken!" She uttered the word with an eager look and with strong emphasis and with a weird smile that had kind of a boast in it. Afterward, she kept her hands there for a little while and slowly took them away as if they were heavy. "I am tired," said Miss Havisham. "I want diversion, and I have done with men and women. Play." I think it will be conceded by my most disputatious reader that she could hardly have directed an unfortunate boy to do anything in the wide world more difficult to be done under the circumstances. "I sometimes have sick fancies," she went on, "and I have a sick fancy that I want to see some play. There, there," with an impatient movement of the fingers of her right hand, "play, play, play." For a moment, with the fear of my sisters working me before my eyes, I had a desperate idea of starting around the room in the assumed character of Mr. Pumblechook's chaise cart, but I felt myself so unequal to the performance that I gave it up and stood looking at Miss Havisham in what I suppose she took for a dogged manner, inasmuch as she said, when we had taken a good look at each other, "Are you sullen and obstinate?" "No, ma'am. I'm very sorry for you, and very sorry I can't play just now. If you complain of me, I shall get into trouble with my sister. So I would do it if I could, but it's so new here, and so strange, and so fine, and melancholy." I stopped, fearing I might say too much, or already had, and we took another look at each other. Before she spoke, she turned her eyes from me and looked at the dress she wore, and at the dressing table, and finally at herself in the looking glass. "So new to him," she muttered, "so old to me, so strange to him, so familiar to me, so melancholy to both of us. Call Estella." As she was still looking at the reflection of herself, I thought she was still talking to herself and kept quiet. "Call Estella," she repeated, flashing a look at me. "You can do that. Call Estella at the door." To stand in that dark and mysterious passage of an unknown house, bawling Estella to a scornful young lady neither visible nor responsive, and feeling at a dreadful liberty so to roar out her name, was almost as bad as playing to order. But she answered at last, and her light came along the long dark passage like a star. Go ahead and highlight that last sentence. The word Estella, the name for this character, Estella is Latin for star. And every time we hear about Pip's description of Estella, it's going to be aligned with other descriptors like light and star. She is brightness against this darkness. A lot like that Romeo and Juliet motif we saw over and over again. Miss Havisham beckoned her to come close and took up a jewel from the table and tried its effect upon her fair young bosom against her pretty brown hair. Your own one day, my dear, and you will use it well. Let me see you play cards with this boy. With this boy? Why, he is a common laboring boy. I thought I overheard Miss Havisham answer, only it seems so unlikely. Well, you can break his heart. What do you play, boy? Asked Estella of myself, with the greatest disdain. Nothing but beggar my neighbor, miss. Beggar my neighbor was a card game that Pip would have played back a long time ago. Beggar him, said Miss Havisham to Estella. So we sat down to cards. It was then I began to understand that everything in the room had stopped, like the watch and the clock a long time ago. I noticed that Miss Havisham put down the jewel exactly on the spot from which she had taken it up. As Estella dealt the cards, I glanced at the dressing table again and saw that the shoe upon it, once white, now yellow, had never been worn. I glanced down at the foot from which the shoe was absent and saw that the silk stocking on it, once white, now yellow, had been trodden ragged. Without this arrest of everything, this standing still of all the pale decayed objects, not even the withered bridal dress on the collapsed form could have looked so like grave clothes, or the long veil so like a shroud. A shroud is that cloth that you place over the deceased when you lay them down for burial. So she sat, corpse-like, as we played at cards, the frillings and trimmings on her bridal dress looking like earthly paper. I knew nothing then of the discoveries that are occasionally made of bodies buried in ancient times, which fall to powder in the moment of being distinctly seen, but I have often thought since that she must have looked as if the admission of the natural light of day would have struck her to dust. He calls the knaves jacks, this boy, said Estella with disdain before our first game was out. And what coarse hands he has! And what thick boots! I had never thought of being ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair. Her contempt for me was so strong that it became infectious, and I caught it. She won the game, and I dealt. I misdealt. It was only natural, when I knew she was lying in wait for me to do wrong, and she denounced me for a stupid, clumsy, laboring boy. You say nothing of her, remarked Miss Havisham to me as she looked on. She says many hard things of you, but you say nothing of her. What do you think of her? I don't like to say, I stammered. Tell me in my ear, said Miss Havisham, bending down. I think she is very proud, I replied in a whisper. Anything else? I think she is very pretty. Anything else? I think she's very insulting. She was looking at me then with a look of supreme aversion. Anything else? I think I should like to go home and never see her again, though she is so pretty. I am not sure that I shouldn't like to see her again, but I should like to go home now. You shall go soon, said Miss Havisham aloud. Play the game out. Saving for the one weird smile at first, I should have felt almost sure that Miss Havisham's face could not smile. It had dropped into a watchful and brooding expression, most likely when all the things about her had become transfixed, and it looked as if nothing could ever lift her up again. Her chest had dropped so that she stooped, and her voice had dropped so that she spoke low and with a dead lull upon her. Altogether she had the appearance of having dropped, body and soul, within and without, under the weight of a crushing blow. I'm going to highlight that last bit too. I played the game to an end with Estella, and she beggared me. She threw the cards down on the table when she had won them all, as if she despised them for having been one of me. "When shall I have you here again?" said Miss Havisham. "Let me think." I was beginning to remind her that today was Wednesday, when she checked me with her former impatient movement of the fingers of her right hand. "There, there! I know nothing of the days of the week. I know nothing of the weeks of the year. Come again after 6 days. Do you hear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Estella, take him down. Let him have something to eat, and let him roam and look about while he eats. Go, Pip." I followed the candle down as I had followed the candle up, and she stood it in the place where we had found it. Until she opened the side entrance, I had fancied, without thinking about it, that it must necessarily be night time. The rush of the daylight quite confounded me, and made me feel as if I had been in the candlelight of the strange room for many hours. "You are to wait here, you boy," said Estella, and disappeared and closed the door. I took the opportunity of being alone in the courtyard to look at my coarse hands and my common boots. My opinion of those accessories was not favorable. They had never troubled me before, but they troubled me now, as vulgar appendages. I determined to ask Joe why he had ever taught me to call those picture cards jacks, which ought to be called knaves. I wish Joe had been rather more genteelly brought up, and that I should have been so too. She came back with some bread and meat and a little mug of beer. She put the mug down on the stones of the yard and gave me the bread and meat without looking at me, as insolently as if I were a dog in disgrace. I was so humiliated, hurt, spurned, offended, angry, sorry. I cannot hit upon the right name for the smart, God knows what its name was, that tears started to my eyes. The moment they sprang there, the girl looked at me with a quick delight in having been the cause of them. This gave me power to keep them back and to look at her. So she gave a contemptuous toss, but with a sense, I thought, of having made too sure that I was so wounded, and left me. But when she was gone, I looked about me for a place to hide my face in, and got behind one of the gates of the brewery lane, and leaned my sleeve against the wall there, and leaned my forehead on it, and cried. As I cried, I kicked the wall and took a hard twist at my hair. So bitter were my feelings, and so sharp was the smart without a name that needed counteraction. My sister's bringing up had made me sensitive. In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. I'm going to highlight that sentence in the next couple ones too. It goes back to that theme we started with about the injustice and pain of childhood trauma. There's nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. It may be only small injustice the child can be exposed to, but the child is small, and its world is small, and its rocking horse stands as many hands high according to scale as a big-boned Irish hunter. Within myself, I had sustained from my babyhood a perpetual conflict with injustice. I had known from the time when I could speak that my sister, in her capricious and violent coercion, was unjust to me. I had cherished a profound conviction that her bringing me up by hand gave her no right to bring me up by jerks. Through all of my punishments, disgraces, fasts and vigils, and other penitential performances, I had nursed this assurance, and to my communing so much with it in a solitary and unprotected way, I in great part refer the fact that I was morally timid and very sensitive. I got rid of my injured feelings for the time by kicking them into the brewery wall and twisting them out of my hair, and then I smoothed my face with my sleeve and came from behind the gate. The bread and meat were acceptable, and the beer was warming and tingling, and I was soon in spirits to look about me. To be sure, it was a deserted place, down to the pigeon house in the brewery yard, which had been blown crooked on its pole by some high wind, and would have made the pigeons think themselves at sea, if there had been any pigeons there to be rocked by it. But there were no pigeons in the dovecot, no horses in the stable, no pigs in the sty, No malt in the storehouse, no smells of grains and beer in the copper of the vat. All the uses and scents of the brewery might have evaporated with its last reek of smoke. In a by-yard there was a wilderness of empty casks, which had a certain sour remembrance of better days lingering about them, but it was too sour to be accepted as the sample of the beer that was gone, and in this respect I remember those recluses as being like most others. But behind the furthest end of the brewery was a rank garden with an old wall, not so high but that I could struggle up and hold on long enough to look over it and see that the rank garden was the garden of the house, and that it was overgrown with tangled weeds, but that there was a track upon the green and yellow paths as if someone sometimes walked there, and that Estella was walking away from me even then. But she seemed to be everywhere. For when I yielded to the temptation presented by the casks and began to walk on them, I saw her walking on them at the ends of the yard of casks. She had her back towards me and held her pretty brown hair spread out in her two hands, and never looked round and passed out of my view directly. So in the brewery itself, by which I mean the large paved lofty place in which they used to make the beer, and where the brewing utensils still were, when I first went into it, and, rather oppressed by its gloom, stood near the door looking about me, I saw her pass among the extinguished fires, and ascend some light iron stairs, and go out by a gallery high overhead, as if she were going out into the sky. It was in this place and at this moment that a strange thing happened to my fancy. I thought it was a strange thing then, and I thought it a stranger thing long afterwards. I turned my eyes, a little dim by looking up at the frosty light, towards a great wooden beam in a low nook of the building near me on my right hand, and I saw a figure hanging there by the neck, a figure all in yellow white, with but one shoe to the feet, and it hung so that I could see the faded trimmings of the dress were like earthly paper, and that the face was Miss Havisham's, with a movement going over the whole countenance as if she were trying to call to me. In the terror of seeing the figure, and in the terror of being certain that it had not been there a moment before, I at first ran from it, and then ran towards it, and my terror was greatest of all when I found no figure there. Nothing less than the frosty light of the cheerful sky, and the sight of people passing beyond the bars of the courtyard gate, and the reviving influence of the rest of the bread and meat and beer would have brought me round. Even with those aids, I might not have come to myself as soon as I did, but that I saw Estella approaching with the keys to let me out. She would have some fair reason for looking down upon me, I thought, if she saw me frightened, and she should have no fair reason. She gave me a triumphant glance in passing me, as if she rejoiced that my hands were so coarse and my boots were so thick, and she opened the gates and stood holding it. I was passing out without looking at her, when she touched me with a taunting hand. "Why don't you cry?" "Because I don't want to." "You do," said she. "You've been crying till you're half blind, and you're near crying again now." She laughed contemptuously, pushed me out, and locked the gate upon me. I went straight to Mr. Pumblechook's, and was immensely relieved to find him not at home. So, leaving word with the shopman on what day I was wanted at Miss Havisham's again, I set off on the 4-mile walk to our forge, pondering as I went along on all I had seen, and deeply revolving that I was a common laboring boy, and that my hands were coarse, and that my boots were thick, and I had fallen into a despicable habit of calling knaves jacks, that I was much more ignorant than I had considered myself last night, and generally that I was in a low-lived, bad way. So our summary of Chapter 8, this is Pip's first visit to the Satis house, where he encounters the captivating Estella and the grotesque Miss Havisham. Pip feels humiliated, and Estella and Miss Havisham seem to enjoy it, and Pip, for the first time, is acutely aware of his lower class. Some characterization that we get in here. Estella is beautiful and cruel. Right away, we can take a good guess of which archetype she is as we write her down in our characterization chart. Pip does want to see her again, but he's afraid to say it. We see, and Estella also, her name is Latin for star. And every time that we see Estella described throughout this book, we're going to pay attention. Just like Juliet in Romeo and Juliet, how Estella is described as light and star, especially standing out against the darkness. Miss Havisham is hideous and vengeful. She is an older woman. She's been in this dress for, well, we don't know how long, but she told Pip that she's been in this dress for since before he was born. She is this old, shrunken skeleton of a woman. And there's the very real question of, is she already dead? Is she a skeleton? Is she a ghost? What is she? Especially the way Pip described her. She is definitely our old hag witch archetype who's locked up in her Gothic mansion. But then also at page 62, the fourth paragraph from the end of the chapter, he swears that he saw her hanging, and he ran towards it. And when he ran towards it, he didn't see it again. In Victorian literature, people loved ghosts. You had to have ghosts and hauntings somewhere in your literature. So this is also Dickens playing to his audience with ghosts and hauntings that we're going to keep seeing throughout the book. This is one of the features that made this book so popular. And the question of, is she dead already? Is she a ghost already? Is a question that we're supposed to have. In the saddest house, our characterization, this is going to be our Gothic mansion. It is Latin for enough. And another thing I think you should take your highlighter to, it's page 61, the last paragraph. Pip describes the garden. This is an ironic garden archetype. Usually gardens are places of peace, hope, and growth, but this is a decaying, overgrown garden. So our chapter 8 analysis. Estella is a character. For those of you who are being alert readers, she's our only other female character besides Biddy, and both Biddy and Pip are described as being just slightly older than Pip, maybe a year or 2 or 3 years older than Pip. So we also get Estella as an immediate foil to Biddy. One's an orphan. Actually, we don't even know the relationship between Estella and Miss Havisham. But both are poor. Biddy is poor. Estella is very rich. Biddy is homely looking, and Estella is absolutely beautiful. One is nice to Pip, and the other is absolutely cruel to Pip. Character analysis of Miss Havisham, Estella, and are all archetypes that we meet here. The other thing about this chapter is, for the first time, Pip is aware of his lower social class and ashamed of it. He repeats it throughout, and he said just last night, it was just last night that he was sitting by the fire with Joe, who he sees has always seen as his equal. Last night he was very proud of that he was learning to read and write, but all of a sudden he wishes that Joe had been more of a gentleman, and that way Pip would be more of a gentleman. And he's ashamed of how ignorant he was when just last night he was so proud. So how much impact that other person can have on Pip's own self-perception. So in closing, go ahead and write your one-sentence chapter summary. Check your comprehension guide. Make sure you and your peers are filling out your characterization chart. And that question I'm going to ask you again towards the end of the week. Who do these characters remind you of? I've already named Harry Potter, James from James and the Giant Peach. And now that I'm reading the chapter again, I'm even thinking of Charlie from Charlie in the Factory. These orphans who have a heart of gold, who were dealt some injustice as a child, they feel sympathetic to the many pains and needs of children and keep that gold heart as they go through their lives. So who else do these characters remind you of? Not just the protagonist, but some of the other ones as well. So thank you for joining me. And then we'll head into chapter 9. Have a good night.